There is a part of you that you have never introduced yourself to, a part that lives below the surface of your daily conversations, below the polished image you carry into the world, below even your most private thoughts. It doesn't speak in words exactly. It speaks in the flash of irritation you feel towards someone who has done nothing wrong. It speaks in the dream that disturbs you enough to make you lie awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, unable to name what you felt. It speaks in the sudden surge of jealousy, the inexplicable shame, the desire you refuse to admit you carry. This part of you has a name. Carl Jung called it the shadow. And for most of us, it is the most important thing about ourselves that we will never consciously choose to examine, because examining it requires something we almost never have: the courage to look at ourselves with complete honesty. This is not a comfortable story. I want to be clear about that from the beginning. What Jung was pointing toward when he described the shadow was not some dark, demonic force lurking in a corner of your psychology, waiting to possess you like a scene from a horror film. It was something far more ordinary, and in many ways far more disturbing than that. The shadow is simply the sum of everything you have decided, consciously or unconsciously, that you cannot be. It is the repository of every quality you rejected in yourself to survive childhood, to be loved, to be accepted, to be seen as good. It is the graveyard of the parts of you that other people told you were wrong, ugly, too much, too little, inappropriate, unacceptable. And here is what Jung spent his life trying to tell us. Those buried parts don't disappear. They go underground, and everything that goes underground finds another way to the surface. Think about the last time someone made you genuinely furious. Not a mild annoyance, but a hot, disproportionate rage that surprised even you with its intensity. Jung would ask you a question about that moment that you might find uncomfortable. What is it about that person that you cannot tolerate in yourself? Not because you are the same as them, not because your anger isn't valid, but because the psychological principle that Jung discovered across decades of clinical work is that what we cannot accept in others is almost always a mirror of something we cannot accept in ourselves. The things that disturb us most deeply in the outer world tend to be projections, shadows cast outward because we refuse to see them within. This is the concept he called projection, and it is one of the most unsettling ideas in all of psychology, because if you follow it to its logical end, it forces a radical rethinking of every relationship you have ever had and every judgment you have ever made about another human being. Every villain in your personal story becomes a character worth interrogating. Every moment of contempt becomes an invitation to self-examination. This does not mean that other people are blameless or that harm isn't real. It means that the emotional charge, the electricity in your reaction is telling you something about yourself that you haven't yet been willing to hear. Jung arrived at these ideas not as an armchair philosopher, but as a practicing psychiatrist who spent years sitting with people in some of the deepest suffering a human being can experience. He was a student of Freud's, for a time his closest intellectual ally and designated heir, before the two had a falling out that was, by all accounts, as psychologically revealing as anything either of them had ever written. Freud believed the unconscious was primarily a container for repressed sexual desire and the conflicts it produced. Jung looked deeper and saw something vaster. He saw the unconscious not as a basement full of shameful urges, but as an entire ocean, one that contained not just personal history, but something he called the collective unconscious, a shared psychological inheritance carried in the biology of every human being who has ever lived. The archetypes, the ancient patterns, the hero, the great mother, the trickster, the shadow. When Jung wrote about the shadow, he was not writing abstractly. He was writing from the inside of his own experience, from years of what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period in his life, beginning around 1913, when he deliberately entered into dialogue with the images and figures that arose from the depths of his own psyche. He kept a journal of this process, illustrated it with paintings and drawings, and spent years working through material that he described as both terrifying and transformative. This journal became known as the Red Book, a manuscript so personal and so strange that Jung refused to publish it in his lifetime. It was finally released to the world in 2009, more than 40 years after his death, and when people opened it, they found something that looked less like a psychology textbook and more like a medieval illuminated manuscript written by a man in full confrontation with his own inner life. It was not the work of someone who was merely theorizing about the unconscious. It was the work of someone who had gone there and come back. What he brought back was this understanding. The shadow is not your enemy. It is the part of yourself that has been waiting, sometimes for decades, for you to stop running. And the moment you stop, the moment you turn toward it with curiosity rather than fear, it begins to transform. Not into something comfortable necessarily, but into something integrated, into something that can be known and therefore no longer needs to control you from below the surface of your awareness. The process Jung described for doing this is what he called individuation. The long, difficult, often painful work of becoming a whole person rather than a half person pretending to be complete. And at the center of that work is shadow integration. It is the psychological equivalent of what mystics across every tradition have described as the dark night of the soul. The necessary descent before any genuine ascent is possible. Most of us never begin this work because we are never taught that it exists. We are raised in cultures that reward performance, that celebrate achievement, that measure our worth by what we produce and how we appear. We learn from a very young age that certain emotions are acceptable and others are not. Little boys learn that sadness is weakness. Little girls learn that anger is ugly. Children of every background learn that desire, especially desire that makes adults uncomfortable, is something to be hidden, managed, or denied. And so we begin, at a very young age, the process of splitting ourselves in two: the person we show the world and the person we lock in a room and tell not to make a sound. Jung had a name for the public self, the mask we wear for society's benefit. He called it the persona, after the masks worn by actors in ancient Greek theater. The persona is not entirely false. It contains real parts of who we are, but it is always incomplete. It is always a selection, a curated version of the self that has been optimized for social survival rather than authentic wholeness. And the more exclusively we identify with our persona, the more we become our mask, the thicker and more defended our shadow becomes. Because everything that doesn't fit the mask has to go somewhere, and it goes into the dark. You can recognize someone who is heavily identified with their persona by a particular kind of rigidity. They cannot tolerate uncertainty. They become deeply anxious when their self-image is challenged. They are often harshly judgmental of others, because projection is the psychological release valve of a shadow that has nowhere else to go. They may appear confident, even impressive, but there is something brittle underneath, something that reacts too quickly, defends too fiercely, insists too loudly. Jung observed this pattern in individuals, but he also observed it in nations, in ideologies, in entire civilizations. The history of human violence, he argued, could be understood in large part as the history of collective shadow projection, of groups of people casting their unacknowledged darkness onto other groups and then pursuing that darkness with righteous fury. It is one of the most chilling ideas in the history of psychology, and the older you get and the more history you read, the harder it is to argue with. But let's bring it back to the personal level, because that is where the work always begins. It begins in your own kitchen, your own bedroom, your own silent 3 a.m. It begins in the moment when you notice something in yourself that you would rather not notice, and you pause instead of immediately turning away. Here is an exercise that Jung's followers have used for generations, and that modern psychotherapists still return to again and again because of how reliably it works. Think of the person in your life, past or present, who provokes the strongest negative reaction in you. Not mild dislike, genuine intensity. The person who makes your jaw tighten, whose voice alone can ruin your mood, whose behavior strikes you as not just wrong, but somehow intolerable. Hold that person in your mind. Now ask yourself with as much honesty as you can muster, what specifically is the quality I cannot stand about them? Is it their arrogance, their neediness, their dishonesty, their selfishness? their cowardice, their cruelty. Name it as precisely as you can. And then, and this is the step that requires real courage, ask yourself, where does that quality live in me? Not necessarily in the same form, not necessarily expressed in the same way, but somewhere in some corner of your life or your history, where have you been that thing you despise? Most people, when they first try this, feel an immediate resistance that is almost physical. The mind rebels. It offers counter-arguments. It produces evidence for why this particular person is genuinely different, genuinely worse, genuinely not a mirror but simply a bad human being. And sometimes, of course, that is true. Jung was not naive about the reality of harm or the existence of people who cause genuine damage. But he would invite you to sit with the discomfort a little longer, because the quality of the resistance itself is information. The more intensely you resist the comparison, the more likely it is that the comparison is touching something real. This is not self-punishment. This is not an invitation to collapse into guilt or self-loathing. Jung was explicit about this. The goal of shadow work is not to make you feel terrible about yourself. It is to make you whole. There is an enormous difference between self-examination and self-attack. The inner voice that says you are broken, shameful, fundamentally wrong, that is not your shadow speaking. That is often your shadow's guard, the inner critic who has been trained to keep you from looking too closely at what lies beneath. Real shadow work is done with curiosity, the way a scientist approaches an unexpected experimental result, not with judgment, but with genuine interest. What is this? Where does it come from? What is it trying to tell me? Because the shadow is always trying to tell you something. That is the thing that gets lost in the popular understanding of this concept. The shadow is not simply a dump site for everything terrible about you. It contains gold as well as darkness. Jung used that phrase explicitly, the gold in the shadow, to describe the unlived potential, the buried gifts, the abandoned capacities that get thrown into the unconscious along with everything else we were taught to disown. The child who was told they were too sensitive may have buried one of the greatest capacities for human empathy the world has ever seen. The teenager who was mocked for their creativity may have locked away a gift that could have changed lives. The adult who learned that anger was unacceptable may have suppressed not just destructive rage, but also the fierce, protective love that is anger's most dignified expression. When you begin doing shadow work, you are not only confronting your darkness, you are also beginning to recover yourself. You are beginning the process of finding out who you actually are, rather than who you were trained to perform. And that recovery is one of the most quietly revolutionary things a human being can do. Not because it makes you more impressive or more successful, though it often does, but because it makes you more real, more present, more genuinely capable of connecting with other human beings in a way that isn't mediated by mass and projections and the unconscious performance of a self you were handed by someone else's expectations. Jung described this process as the most important work of the second half of life. In the first half, he argued, we are necessarily oriented outward, building careers, establishing relationships, constructing identities, acquiring the social competence we need to function in the world. We need the persona in the first half of life. We couldn't survive without it. But somewhere in midlife, and for different people, this can happen at very different chronological ages, something shifts. The achievements that were supposed to be satisfying don't quite satisfy. The relationships that were supposed to be fulfilling reveal themselves to be built on patterns rather than genuine contact. The identity that seems so solid begins to feel like a costume. And if we are lucky, if we are paying attention, we feel the pull from below. The invitation from the unconscious to do the deeper work. The call to individuation. Not everyone answers that call. Jung observed this too. Many people reach the threshold of this inner work and turn back because it is genuinely difficult, because it requires giving up the comforting illusion of already knowing who you are, because it means tolerating a period of uncertainty and vulnerability that our culture offers almost no framework for navigating. So they redouble their investment in the persona instead. They buy a faster car, take a younger lover, work more, drink more, numb more. Jung watched this happen again and again in the lives of the people who came to him seeking help, people who had arrived at the door of themselves and were terrified to knock. But the people who did knock, the people who were willing to sit with the discomfort, to enter into genuine relationship with the material that arose from their unconscious through dreams and fantasies and the patterns of their waking life. Those people, he observed, were transformed by it, not into perfect human beings, not into people without struggle or conflict or darkness, but into people who were capable of carrying their complexity consciously, who could hold their contradictions without being destroyed by them, who could feel their full range of emotion without being controlled by any single one of it. This is what it means to master your shadow, not to eliminate it, not to transcend it, not to arrive at some enlightened state in which the difficult parts of you have finally been conquered. Mastery in Jung's sense means relationship. It means knowing your shadow well enough that when it stirs, when the familiar heat of projection or denial or compulsion begins to rise, you can recognize it. You can say, "Ah, there you are. I know you. I know what you want. And I am going to choose consciously how to respond to you, rather than being unconsciously driven by you." That distinction between being driven by the unconscious and choosing in relationship to it is everything. It is the difference between a life that happens to you and a life that you participate in authoring. It is the difference between relationships that replay the same unconscious patterns until they collapse, and relationships that can genuinely grow and deepen and surprise you. It is the difference between anger that destroys and anger that protects, between desire that consumes and desire that creates, between fear that paralyzes and fear that alerts. Jung believed, and this is perhaps his most radical and most hopeful claim, that the human psyche is inherently oriented toward wholeness, that given the right conditions, the right kind of attention, the right willingness to look, the psyche will move naturally toward integration, that the suffering we experience is not random or meaningless, but is often the psyche's way of insisting on growth, of pushing up against the walls of a self that has become too small for what we actually are. He called this the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to move beyond apparent opposites and find a new synthesis that contains more of reality than either pole alone could hold. This is why the shadow, paradoxically, is one of the greatest sources of growth available to us. Because in the confrontation with everything we have rejected, everything we have denied, everything we have been afraid to claim, we encounter the full complexity of what it means to be human. And in that encounter, something new becomes possible, not despite our darkness, but through our willingness to know it. There is a line from Jung's writing that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else I have ever read in the field of psychology. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Read that again slowly, because the weight of it is easy to miss on first contact. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The relationship that keeps failing in the same way. The opportunity that always seems to slip away at the last moment. The argument that erupts every time a particular topic is raised. The pattern of self-sabotage that you can see clearly from the outside, but cannot seem to stop from the inside. These things do not feel like choices. They feel like forces, like weather, like something happening to you rather than something arising from within you. But they are not weather. They are architecture. They are the structures built in the darkness of the unconscious that shape every room in your life without your knowing it. And the moment you bring light into that architecture, the moment you begin to see the beams in the walls and the locked doors for what they are, the moment you begin to recognize the patterns as patterns rather than as fate, something fundamentally shifts, because you cannot unsee what you have seen. And seeing, in this context, is the beginning of freedom. This is not a quick process. I want to be honest with you about that, because there is a lot of content in the world right now that promises transformation in 10 steps or 20 minutes or one breakthrough session, and Jung would have found all of it deeply suspicious. The work of individuation is the work of a lifetime. It proceeds in spirals rather than straight lines. You return to the same material again and again, but each time you return, you come with more capacity, more understanding, more willingness to sit with complexity. The goal is not to arrive somewhere final. The goal is to become more genuinely yourself, more continuously, with more awareness and more compassion for the full range of what that self contains. And compassion is not a soft or secondary element of this work. It is the part of you that was cast out, because the shadow,
Often very
remember,
early,
is not simply your
often by
evil
people
twin,
who
meant well, often in circumstances where there was genuinely no other choice. The child who learned to hide their sadness did so because expressing it felt dangerous. The teenager who buried their anger did so because the alternative seemed worse. The adult who cannot tolerate their own vulnerability has very often been in situations where vulnerability was exploited or punished. The shadow is not a collection of your worst impulses freely chosen. It is a collection of the parts of you that survived by going underground. And they deserve to be welcomed back, not with condemnation, but with the kind of understanding you might offer a person who has been in exile for a very long time. This is the hidden spiritual dimension of Jung's psychology, the part that made him so controversial among more strictly scientific colleagues and so beloved among those who felt that psychology needed to hold more of human experience than a laboratory could contain. Jung was not a religious man in any conventional sense, but he was deeply interested in the mystery at the center of human experience, the something that resists final explanation, the depth that never quite bottoms out, the encounter with oneself that always opens into an encounter with something larger. He believed that the psychological work of individuation and the spiritual work of transformation were not separate projects. That in learning to know and integrate the shadow, a person was doing something that the world's great traditions had always pointed toward under different names: the descent into the underworld, the dark night of the soul, the wrestling with the angel, the alchemical process of nigredo and albedo and rubedo, in which base matter is transformed not by being discarded, but by being confronted and slowly, painstakingly transformed. The metaphor of alchemy was one that Jung returned to again and again in his later work, because he saw in the alchemist's obsessive quest to transmute lead into gold a psychological truth that the alchemists themselves may not have fully understood. They were not only, or perhaps not primarily, working with metals, they were working with themselves. The lead was the shadow. The gold was the integrated self. And the process was not instantaneous or comfortable or clean. It required fire and patience and a willingness to be changed by the work rather than merely to do the work. There is a way that this applies to your life right now, today, this week, in the texture of your ordinary experience, that I don't want to lose in the sweep of historical and theoretical context, because it would be very easy to hear all of this and feel that it is somehow abstract, somehow applicable to other people, somehow requiring a therapist's office or a pilgrimage or some extraordinary event before it can be relevant to your daily existence. But Jung's insight was precisely that the material of the shadow is available in the most ordinary moments of your life, if you are willing to look at it. It is available in the dream you dismiss as random. It is available in the annoyance you feel at the colleague who gets recognition you think you deserve. It is available in the guilt you feel after you have said something you didn't intend to say, in the way you talked to yourself last night when no one was listening, in the longing you feel for a life you haven't let yourself want out loud. All of it is data. All of it is your own depth trying to make contact with your surface. The question is not whether your shadow is speaking to you. It is whether you are willing to listen. And listening, genuine listening, the kind that requires you to stop defending and start inquiring, is perhaps the most courageous thing a human being can do. Not the courage of the battlefield or the boardroom, though those have their own demands. The courage of sitting alone with yourself and asking, what is actually true here? What am I actually feeling? What do I actually want? What am I most afraid of seeing? These questions are simple to ask and almost unbearably difficult to answer honestly, but they are the questions that, over time, answered honestly and repeatedly, begin to reveal the architecture of your unconscious to you. They begin to make the unconscious conscious. They begin to transform fate into choice. Jung died in 1961, at the age of 85, having spent more than 60 years of his life in active engagement with the deepest questions of human psychology and human experience. He was, by all accounts, a complicated man, brilliant and difficult, visionary and flawed, capable of extraordinary insight and ordinary human failing. He would not have wanted it any other way. He had looked at his own shadow too directly to pretend to be otherwise. And perhaps that is the most important thing about him. Not the theories, not the archetypes, not the red book, not the decades of clinical work, but the fact that he lived his ideas, that he did the work he was asking his patients to do, that he was willing to descend into his own darkness and to trust that what he found there would not destroy him, but enlarge him. He was right. And if you are willing to begin that same descent, not all at once, not recklessly, but with intention and curiosity and the kind of patient courage that grows slowly over a lifetime, I believe you will find the same thing. Not the end of difficulty, not the elimination of the dark, but something far more valuable, the discovery of yourself, the whole complex, contradictory, irreducible, magnificent entirety of yourself, the part that shines and the part that hides, the part you show the world and the part that waits, still impatient, in the room you have not yet opened. Your shadow is not your enemy. It is perhaps the most faithful part of you, the part that has held everything you couldn't carry yet, waiting for the moment you were strong enough to come and claim it. And that moment, that reckoning, that integration, that return to wholeness is not someday, it is available now. In the next breath, in the next honest question you are willing to ask yourself, in the next moment of discomfort you choose to move toward rather than away from. This is the work. It has always been the work, and it is the most important work you will ever do.